So this webinar is a series of two webinars that together make sense. Today we're having a look at the situation, Romania's outsourcing crisis, and understanding what's next for the tech sector. And next week we have then the series 2, and that would be more about the operating aspect of it, what you can do next. And as we are a venture builder, it's about starting companies, setting up, pivoting your company that you have. Again, if you've today joining us, it makes sense to also come to the next webinar where we talk a bit more about doing the stuff that we are seeing and that we are discussing today, as today we have more of an overlook. Who are we? From our point of view, we're Organisationsdiplomaten. We are like 5 years old. We are working within the CAE Danube region, and we are building products with founders. And to kick off this journey about getting the information, what's happening in the world, what is happening in our industry, what is next for Romania. So when we come back now, after we adjusted our world view, and we look at the outsourcing ecosystem now from an industry point, we are zooming now in. Outsourcing ecosystems are always around the HQ, and that is something that we see now talking to outsourcing partners, talking to people that have been working with big corporations, that this network is changing. So it's not so much a downturn that they're describing, but in a sense of a rupture in the networks, like people and companies. Companies that were decades in the cities are now leaving the cities, downsizing to the tune of 90%. So this is not something seen in previous. And ecosystems always have a zeitgeist. So that means like for 1 or 2 decades, they structure around a certain idea. And the first wave in the 60s was like this conglomerate idea that you had. We had the PC wave in the 70s to the 90s. And then in the 90s, 2000, we had the first internet boom around 2000. It's the time where we see the outsourcing wave reaching Eastern Europe, reaching also Romania, and the start of like the first dedicated outsourcing centers. And we're currently in the 4th wave, or at the end of the 4th wave. So that is the platform and unicorn area, where outsourcing now has been very diversified. So already in the late 90s and 80s, we had development centers spreading around the whole continent. But what we now see is that nearshoring competence center in the CEE are popping up, in Germany popping up, around the world popping up. And what we also see is offshoring offices. So this is when India was becoming a big factor, and Indian outsourcing companies really adding thousands of people. And the big step up of offshoring was because of the technology that introduced the ticket systems that were introduced. So the sharing of the information within the companies. So as in the first wave in conglomerate area, system engineering was always within the company. Now in the 5th wave, it's in IT systems that can be shared and spread around. The 4th wave was particularly good for Romania. So overall, it's second in the CEE from the point of IT services. And it's punching way above its weight. 10,000 students annually join the workforce in IT tech. And there are 250,000 skilled software developers in Romania. And a lot of them are in companies that provide outsourcing services. As you can see, web developing, mobile development, a lot of IT staffing. So that is really interesting to see that, like, with the exclusion of Poland, it is one of the biggest outsourcing places in the world. So there's India, there's some of the South Asian countries, And then is the CEE, if you are doing outsourcing from the US or from Europe point of view. And one of the big points was always that Romania was compared to US salaries, compared to German salaries, lower. So it made sense, it made this budgetary sense. But the plus side is that the workflows, so the incorporation of the people within the workflow of the company were much easier in East Europe than in other parts of the world just because of the clock. So in Southeast Asia, there are whole cities that are living on a different time zone than the rest of the country, where people are waking up in the middle of the night to be working for American countries. And there are people that for years don't see the sun. So this is something that was a lucky coincidence of geopolitics. And now we're coming to geopolitics because we want to see from the point of view that the waves that we have, they always were technology driving an openness, open up societies, and a global trade. And for the first time in 5 decades, geopolitics is now determining technology. And if we go and see on 3 points what we mean by that, or what I mean by that is like in 2018, this iconic picture came along. That was the end of history. So for the last time, the globalized West was staring down the incumbents that said there will be a different kind of globalization. And for 3 more years, that worked. Hyperglobalization and the structures that we knew worked till 2022. And in Germany and around the world, it was called an epochal rupture, and it was called the Zeitenwende. And what you can see by that is, from that point onwards, this hyperglobalization idea and the idea how to build where, what, was really put into jeopardy. And with the next couple of slides, I want to show you how societies in Germany, the US, in the CE, for the last couple of years, try to make sense. And the big 2 shifts are, do we continue with hyperglobalization, rebuilding the structures? And that was in the very beginning of the Zeitenwende, this idea that we come together, we are building up the systems, the global systems, or are we entering a completely new world? So the first set of books that came along very early on described the hyperglobalized world now in a very different kind of picture. It showed a very unevenly distributed technology spread around development centers and chains. Chip wars showed really for the first time that there were no choke points, same as underground empire, that were set up because some countries at some point in history built some infrastructure that was now abundantly used. For example, the internet services run on big data centers that are like 16 of the main ones are in the US, a couple of them are in Europe, same as banking was set up in Belgium. So both of them showed that those choke points were becoming more and more playgrounds on geopolitics to turn off and on this globalized world. And Apple and China had a particular important impact. One of the questions was, how could the rest gain so much knowledge? And what Apple and China showed is that they did nation-building exercises as a company. So they trained 23 million people in the US to build devices. So the CE is famous for electronics, same as Germany. And when we look at the mobile phone, the last mobile phones developed in Germany were Sony Ericsson and Siemens. And around that time, there was a decline in manufacturing in Germany, and it swapped to China. And for a long time, the development centers in Germany couldn't make sense of it, how China could outproduce them now in quality. And that book now shows that at around this time when Siemens stopped developing mobile phones, Apple stepped into China and introduced this new wave of manufacturing straight from the US. So a couple of years into the Zeitenwende, people now understand that hyperglobalization is a multifaceted thing. And then a bit later, they also showed the impacts that it had on societies. So societies turned on themselves. So this is a war on wealth, where you have a lot of unreasoning debate going on. And abundance from F. Klein showed that policies around the world, so this is not just Romania, have stifled infrastructure projects. So building stuff becomes more and more problematic. And latest Technology Republic really shows that there's a decoupling of society problems with technology. For example, when I say, let's introduce a new technology, every police officer will get an app that surveillance everybody around him 24/7. The first reaction is in most societies that this is an overstep and we have civil rights and we shouldn't everybody 24/7 constant. And Alexander really pointed out that this debate has shifted over the years on a political thing to really also stifle it. And what you can see with those books is it took the society a couple more years to understand what is happening with the globalization within the society and how it had adverse effects within the society and what could happen next. But the two books that really define this phase, the fifth phase of technology, is The End of the World is Just the Beginning from Peter Sine. He was one of the first saying that globalization is happening. So hyperglobalization, outsourcing in a nutshell, is coming to an end. And he made a very easy, understandable logic chain around that. So he said globalization is an accident. Globalization is happening as a security measure by the Americans in the Cold War, where they bribed the rest of the world to fight against the other half of the world. And it was never intended as an economic policy. So after the Cold War, the adversaries of the Cold War were let into that system because it was not seen as an economic thing, but it was seen as a security thing. And the whole debate about globalization, deglobalization, and all the politics in the US in the last 20 years can be seen as this thing that they have built up, a security structure that they don't need anymore. And Science is saying here very clearly that one day the US will just step away because it's just a hustle. And the other book that we really have to understand is like the build-up of the countries that we have, from Romania to Germany to England, they're not slowing down. It is not so much that they are in decline, but the rest of the world is rising up to them. And I think this picture is really missing in a lot of the debates that I have also with people starting startups. Look, it's so much harder now in like a village in the middle of nowhere where you have now the internet, you have now the access, the same access that you would have in New York 30 years ago. So this really distorts our viewpoint and really helps us to understand that from that point of view, also the industry is misled. So in 2026, this chapter of what happened after hyperglobalization is closing. So in Davos, Carney gave a speech and he said that the rule-based order is breaking, it's not evolving, it's done, it's broken. So with a hopeful beginning 3 years ago that maybe we can have the rule-based order and hyperglobalization is now coming to an end, he put it off the table. And he says we now have to rebuild something in its effect. And the point that I'm making here is if we have a country like Romania or other countries in the CEE that are dependent on international trade, that are dependent on outsourcing and global companies shifting development from their HQ to nearshoring to offshoring, the break in structure has a direct impact in that because it now creates blocks where maybe the latest technologies are not allowed to be moved. It means that maybe the internet as we know will break apart. It is already broken into the Chinese internet. Half of the world is working, and in our Western internet. So this could mean now going into the future that technologies in itself will be fracturing. That is actually also a positive side for Romania. So if you're building a manufacturing or if you're building a development center, it will stay in the sphere of the EU for a couple more decades to go. If you're building the same thing anywhere else in the world, it could mean that you lose access to them as local policies and politics around that makes the access of those areas impossible for you. So we have already seen that when the Red Sea was closed down last year by a rebel group. Suddenly, ships that were cruising from China to Europe, bringing goods back and forth, doubled their time, doubled their amount of money that they needed, having a huge adverse effect again on chains. Coming from this broader view now, what is the industry doing in this upheaval where there is no up and down? And we have to understand that for the last decade, we had a huge party going on, probably the best of times in our generation, and we are now feeling this overhead, this headache after this party. And I want to make it on two industries. One is the automotive overbuild. So automotive is a big sector in Romania and in the CE with dozens of factories and hundreds of development centers spread around the 15 countries. And 15 years ago, we have seen that the product that the automobile industry is presenting to its customer doubled. So this silver arrow is a concept, but it is not a combustion engine, it is an electric engine. So the silver arrow exists with a different concept car as a combustion engine. And Mercedes, in that case, doubled its portfolio, meaning that for each of its products, it has only half of the demand if everything else is equal. And that led to the development of so many car products that grows the demand of outsourcing. So this was an artificial situation in the industry, combined with the industry power to set the price point at will. So price points of cars rose by 50% in the last 7 years, and 3 times as much as the market average would suppose. And that means the companies were swimming in cash. The stock buybacks and other incentives to shareholders rose to peak in around 2022, where billions of euros were given back to the shareholders. And that is a sign that the company doesn't know what to do with the money. And the same is happening on the IT side. So we have this COVID surge, that picture of that man. That is how the industry saw 5 years, 6 years ago, how we would work today. Everybody had a headset and a keyboard, and they thought that the offices were filled with people on headsets. And the demand on Zoom and the demand on other internet technologies was so high that they were staffing people by the hundreds of thousands. And also we have seen that in the outsourcing services. So we had 2 industries 3 years ago that were at their peak, in a bubble, one can even say. And that now, focusing on the country, we can see that the first phase of early outsourcing 2000s corresponds with the third phase of web development, first time where you do not need to develop on site. And the golden years were around 2009 to 2015, where you had a strong growth, and the peak was around 2020. And from that peak, we didn't have a decline, but we went into this COVID surge, where we had the maximum on contracts in the CEE served by outsourcing. And in 2023, we had this turning point. And the question is now with 2023, is this a turning point in a sense of we stabilize on that high point and we have a downsizing that is temporary, so a cool down, or something else? And now we are coming from this point to the scenarios. So we are now looking into the history and seeing what has happened to make sense of it, how it affects globalization, hyperglobalization, and deglobalization, and the effects on the industries, and then the demand for outsourcing that follows. We are now looking into the future. And if we look into the future, what comes in phase 6, 2025 and plus, we have 3 possibilities. So we have a strategic pivot that could impact. We have a managed contraction, so we have a freeze on this higher demand, or we have a structural decline. And when we talk about a strategic inflection point, Andy Grove's Only the Paranoid Survive is a really good book. It's around the 1980s that he wrote, but he wrote it around the time when the technology demanded Intel to do a shift. And he says that the inflection point is a point when the fundamentals of the business is changing. And that is a point that I'm making, and a lot of people that I talk to are feeling that outsourcing business model, where you have a service and developing as a service software, has a fundamentally broken promise now. And we can see that on quite clear dimensions. So one of the things is that the deal pipelines are drying up. So when you talk, you hear a lot that we now have to do sales. So mostly that translates to that we now have to do prospecting. So in the industries, when you work in outsourcing, you have a black book of people that you work with, or you're directly incorporated in a structure. And that black book, for the last 15 years, you did a couple of calls, you had a couple of people, and then you got contract. Those black books becoming worthless as people are leaving in the HQ. So just to give you context, I worked with 4 companies in Germany that used nearshoring and offshoring. And at peak, over 100 Romanian people were deployed by the various centers that I worked for and with. None of those 4 companies exist anymore. They are all scattered. They are all shut down. So when I go through my CV, I only have busted companies. And those were sometimes conglomerates of 10, 20,000 people that have been reduced now to a couple of hundred, sold and reassorted and cut. And that is something that when I talk to the people in the CE, that they don't see that point of view, that the HQs are disappearing. So there's nobody on the other side in the black book to pick up the phone. And that means that the demand is shifting. And the interesting part is that those HQs that I worked for, some of them have been now moved out of Europe. And what I'm seeing is that instead of doing nearshoring, if there's demand, 3 years ago, Wipro and other big players out of India locked in. So we have now an offshoring. And because of the time difference, the relationship is not on equal partnership. As stresses go higher in the management, there is a much more appreciation to just move out the complete development to India. So as in Europe, you always had the HQ and the competence center, development centers as a network and everybody sharing the understanding. Now German companies are moving out complete technologies to India or Chinese development centers. And this means that those technologies are not coming back to Europe. The other thing, and this is something that I hear when I talk to people quite a lot, is that the cost and tax advantages have been cut in the last couple of years. Moldova is quite famous with its low taxes. Other countries had similar schemes, but currently, within the last 6 months, everybody in Romania was an IT project manager, and that tax incentive evaporated, meaning that the scorecards that people have, how much sense it makes economically to move to Romania, has been tilted in the negative. And the perception is changing. This safe bet that Romania has a special strategic place in the outsourcing network is diminishing. So given all those points, we have now indicators that we're not just in a downside, but we have a fundamental breakage in the relationships. And we have a fundamental change in the market in Romania and in the hiring strategies. And it's quite worse in other places. So when you talk to Poland, for example, Americans know where Poland is on the map. So Polish service contractors do have access to the American market as they are like well known. Romania is already a very foreign country that has not that easy access. And if you go down to Croatia, Bulgaria, those countries has almost no access anymore outside of the black books and personal connections that exist. So this also have a severe impact of this IT collapsing as the downsizing in the HQs leave managers now to go to safe harbors, and those safe harbors may be one day not Romania anymore. So scenario one is the managed contractions. So for developers, tech leads, and founders, it means that there will be fewer local jobs and there will be more competition. If you are still in a company, it means that you won't have that many chances of increasing your salary. It means that your careers are stalling out. It also has a funny thing that it's getting harder to get back in. So if you are out of a job and you get hired, then the demand is that you have to cut your salary by 5 to 20%. So you would pretty much lose everything that you worked for in the last 10 years. And a lot of people have enough money in the bank that they sit that out. So they are saying like, okay, I'm not going to work in a company that pays me 15, 20% less. And that means we have now a lot of developers in Romania and other CEE countries and cities that are burning their reserves in the hope that the market comes back. It is the survivors takes everything. So those people that are still in the companies, they close the doors. This normal hiring frenzy is not continuing. If we have a strategic pivot, it would mean that the companies within Romania are changing. So you would see less international companies or international companies leaving, as we have seen, but local companies stepping in. And we don't want to talk too much about this. This is for the second webinar, but in a nutshell, that strategic pivot would mean that Romanians understand that from a technology point of view and from a development point of view, they are in the premier league of the world, and built in Romania could be a quality aspect that would lead Romanian products then used in other countries. So it would be a reversal of the relationships. And the least favorite, but likely scenario is a structural decline. As I said, we have the geopolitics that are now seeing a deglobalization in the world. We have two of the main industry driving the demand for outsourcing coming out of the bubble, and there have not been yet any good solutions. So if you look at Bosch, Conti, ZF, those are the major automotive suppliers, they are cutting every development that they had of the last 20 years out of them. So, for example, Conti just split itself in half. And 20 years ago, it started as a tire manufacturer and added more and more services and technologies. And as of 2026, they are just a tire company. And everything that they have built, they just sold off. And this really means also the end of this powerhouse in Germany and this continuing understanding that the industry will be bigger next year. And that could have a huge effect now on Romania that we see now with the AI downsizing, a growing push to immigrate or go full remote, and local career paths shrink wages pressure over time. So that would mean that in the first scenario, we would have a decline of 10, 20% overall. Here, we wouldn't stop at 30% loss. We would continue to go down until we have like 10, 20% left in the industry. And I have seen that. So where I am located here, that is a printing center. So just 20 years ago, a printing press was in this room. And in the local area, there were like over 1,000 people hired as printers. None of them exist today anymore. The complete houses left and right of me are empty. Same goes with Sony Ericsson, the development center for the mobile phones. They are like a 10-minute drive. This is an office complex of 7,000 people, completely empty for the last 20 years. So Stuttgart went through multiple of those downsizings, but compensated. Other areas in Germany, Ruhrgebiet, saw a decline in available jobs by 60-70%. Something similar already has happened in Romania with the old industries after the 90s or within the 90s, but it has not been felt for this urban tech community. That is a real possibility. So this structural decline is a third scenario that we have. We have then a firefighting mode instead of building more politics. So we have then also this adverse thing within the companies that the development teams in Romania learned a lot from each other. That makes Romanian development teams top-tier development teams in the world. But in a structural decline, there is no need to train the juniors that come onto the job, because that would just take away from your productivity. So that means that you would then not have the ability to train up people. That means that you have even less potential to develop higher products, meaning that the decline would go faster. So I hope that was helpful to really get an understanding and place the situation that we have in Romania, not just on the local policies that you see, on local debates, on this or that decision by a manager, but you can now place it over the last 10 years, and you can place it as a fifth wave of technology. We do have an answer on globalization, that it has ended and a deglobalization world is now being set up. But what that means for everybody, it is still unknown. And now we have a couple more minutes for Q&A. If there's anything specific that we want to do a deep dive on,